Good morning, children. Let us continue with neural control and coordination. And we have already done the cranial nerves, and today we begin with the spinal nerves. The nerves connected with the spinal cord are called the spinal nerves. As the name tells you, nerves connected with the spinal cord are called the spinal nerves. Two spinal nerves arise from each segment of the spinal cord. There are 31 pair of spinal nerves in man. You know the vertebral column protects the spinal cord, and according to the region of the attachment in the spinal cord, you know that in the vertebral column, it has got the cervical region, the thoracic region, the lumbar region, the sacral region and the coccygeal region. So similarly, according to the region of their attachment in the spinal cord, these spinal nerves are christened as cervical nerves, which are 8 pairs, thoracic nerves that are 12 pairs, lumbar nerves that are 5 pairs, sacral nerves 5 pairs and coccygeal nerve 1 pair. Spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They contain both sensory and motor nerve fibers. You have done the cranial nerves, so they were mostly sensory and motor fibers. They were some mixed nerves, but spinal nerves are exclusively mixed, containing both sensory and motor nerve fibers, which are primarily modulated and run between the spinal cord and the peripheral tissues. Each spinal nerve arises from the spinal cord by two routes, a dorsal root and a ventral root. The dorsal root is composed of somatic sensory and visceral sensory fibers. Okay, so it's composed of somatic sensory and visceral sensory fibers. The cell bodies of these fibers are situated outside the spinal cord in a ganglion called the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, now the dendrites of sensory fibers bring sensory information from peripheral tissues, giving rise to sensations like that of touch, temperature or pain, or to involuntary spontaneous activities. I repeat, the dendrites of the sensory fibers bring sensory information from peripheral tissues. So these are the peripheral tissues and they are bringing sensory information from the peripheral tissues, giving rise to sensations like touch, temperature or pain, or to involuntary spontaneous activities. The ventral root is composed of somatic motor and visceral motor fibers. Somatic motor and visceral motor fibers. Their cell bodies are situated in the ventral part of the grey matter of the spinal cord. The ventral root fibers run through muscles and glands. Okay, so you can see muscles and glands. So their fibers, ventral root fibers, they run through muscles and glands in peripheral tissues. Many of these fibers go to the skeletal muscle fibers directly. Others leave the spinal, go to some autonomic ganglion and end there. Both dorsal and ventral roots unite together little outside the spinal cord to form a mixed spinal nerve. And this spinal nerve comes out through a small aperture called intervertebral foramen, present laterally between the successive vertebrae. So both dorsal and ventral roots, they unite together outside the spinal cord and they form a mixed spinal nerve. What is a mixed spinal nerve? Which has got both sensory and motor fibers. Immediately after leaving the vertebral column, each spinal nerve forms 3 branches: a ramus dorsalis, a ramus ventralis and a ramus communicans. Okay, ramus dorsalis contains somatic sensory fibers and supplies skin and muscles of the dorsal body wall. Ramus ventralis is thicker than other branches and contains somatic motor fibers. Ramus communicans joins the sympathetic ganglion of the autonomic nervous system. Reflex action. Spontaneous involuntary activities evoked by the stimulation of receptors are called reflexes. Thus, a reflex action can be defined as a spontaneous, involuntary, nerve-mediated activity produced at the unconscious level by stimulating specific receptors. In fact, a reflex is a mechanism by which sensory impulse, impulse arising from the sense organ, is automatically converted into a motor effect through the involvement of the central nervous system. So what do you have in a reflex mechanism? Sensory impulse converted into a motor effect, and what is involved? The central nervous system, that is the brain and the spinal cord, are involved. Now suppose you can see in this the stage of reflex response, there is a stimulus. The stimulus is taken up by the receptor. Receptor can be any of the sense organ. Then sensory neurons, they convey to the central nervous system. Central nervous system gives the command to the effector or the motor neuron. The motor neuron sends it to the effector, which is usually a muscle or a gland, and the response is created. Like for example, something goes in your eye. So the stimulus is there in the eye, the receptor is the eye, and sensory neuron convey the message to the central nervous system that something has entered into your eye, some particle, foreign body has entered your eye. Central nervous system will give command to the motor neuron, and motor neuron will stimulate the effector. Effector is usually the lacrimal glands, and the response will be tears that would wipe out the foreign body that is present in the eye. So that is the stage of a reflex response. Reflex arc. A reflex is produced by flow of nerve impulses along a specific nerve pathway called reflex arc. So, what will the reflex arc comprise of? The afferent limb, consisting of the receptors and afferent nerves. Receptor is the sense organ, and the nerves arising from the sense organs are the afferent or the sensory nerves. Second will be the efferent limb, consisting of the motor neuron and effector organ. Effector organ will always be a muscle and gland, and the center will be part of the central nervous system where the afferent limb ends, and either synapses directly with the efferent motor neuron or establishes its connection via an intercalated neuron with the efferent motor neuron. A specific stimulus must be applied on a specific group of receptors to elicit the reflex. The receptor present in the skin catches the stimulus, then transmits the impulse to the center via afferent limb. The center integrates the afferent stimulus and the efferent response. Afferent nerve transmits the command to the center, and the effector organ contracts or secretes. As I told you, the example of the eye. So impulses can flow in only one direction in a reflex arc, visibly from an afferent to a connector, then to an efferent organ, because each synapse in a reflex arc allows impulses to cross it in a single direction. Hence, a reflex response can never be elicited in receptors by stimulating the effector of the efferent neuron. Now we'll study about the different types of reflexes. You have done it at class 10th also, and there are two main categories of reflexes, that are unconditioned reflex and conditioned reflexes. So this is important. Unconditioned reflexes are the inborn reflexes, those reflexes that are present since birth. So unconditioned reflexes are inborn, present since birth, and they do not depend upon previous experience. So two things you have to know, that they are inborn, they are present since birth, and they do not depend upon previous experience. The stimulus for such a reflex is an unconditioned stimulus. For example, taste of milk causes salivation even in a newborn baby, though the infant has not tasted it earlier. And the pupil of the eye constrict even if the eye is whenever the eye is illuminated with bright light, just at birth. So these are unconditioned reflexes present since birth. Conditioned or acquired reflexes are those reflexes which develop after birth, and their appearance depends upon previous experiments. So firstly, they develop after birth and their main appearance depends upon previous experience. For instance, when a piece of meat is put in the mouth of a dog or any other animal, it salivates. This is an example of unconditioned reflex. That is, this reflex is not since birth of the animal and requires no training, no practice or no experience. On the other hand, meat without any on the other hand, what happens? On the other hand, as the dog learns to recognize a piece of meat by simply seeing or smelling it, the mere sight or smell of meat without any actual contact results in salivation. That is, even once the dog has tasted meat, and even if you don't offer it meat and you just show it, it will start salivating by the mere smell or sight of it. So this it learned through experience. If it had not tasted the meat, salivation wouldn't have done. So based on this conditioned reflex, a very important experiment was performed by Pavlov. And so now we are going to study about the Pavlov's experiment on dogs. Ivan Petrovich Pavlov, who is regarded as the father of the subject of conditioned reflexes and was awarded the Nobel Prize for his works in gastric physiology involving conditioned reflex, has made significant contributions on conditioned reflexes. Now what happened? He sounded a bell every time he gave some meat to his dog to eat. Okay, what he used to do, he would ring a bell every time before he gave some meat to his dog to eat. After several repetitions of this act, the dog was found to salivate with the sounding of the bell even when it was not followed by food. So, for a few days, he would sound a bell and offer the dog food to eat. He continued it for a few days, and after a few days, even by sounding the bell and not offering the dog food, salivation started. What did the dog do? That means the dog has thus learnt to associate the condition to the ringing of the bell with the meat. So, it had associated or conditioned itself to ringing of the bell with meat. He knew that ringing of the bell, after ringing the bell, meat would be provided, so salivation started. The sound of bell was thus a conditioned stimulus for the salivary reflex of the dog. It is believed that many of our social habits owe their origin to conditioned reflexes. Our faith on region and social customs, thinking process, many of our do's and don'ts of lives are due to conditioned reflexes. So what we learn during our lifetime is the conditioned reflex. Now, what is the importance of conditioned reflexes? They are a very important tool for studying the process of learning and behavior in animals, including man. Some psychiatric disorders are related to conditioned reflexes. The response of a society to a situation depends as a whole on the conditioning of the society, and that is why the response to some extent can be predicted. So, children, with this we complete this topic, reflex action, and in our next class we'll continue with the same chapter. Thank you.